Thank you very much, Professor Vilinkomo. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, and friends, it's a pleasure to be back here in person after a few years, after being away for a few years. Of course, we have interacted on a number of occasions in the different online fora that we've had since COVID. I want to offer a brief introduction, but just to say, before I do that, let me talk about the timeliness of this event, because I think there are transformative things occurring at this moment in the world, for good or bad, but they hold such significance for the African continent that I think having this conversation at this moment in time becomes of fundamental importance. By way of introduction, I think it's important to begin to situate the notion of order and disorder. But let me just say that these two words or phrases, order and disorder, are two paradoxical words that have become some of the most recurring in recent global discussions, with the latter, that is disorder, ironically underlining the changes that have been introduced by the former, the idea of order. And of course, order too, giving indications of impression that they have changed. For Africa, almost always at the receiving end of global vicissitudes, the ramifications of global order and disorder have been significant, with some of this underscoring the contradiction underlying politics, governance, as well as economics. Going in and out, yes. I see the green light on, but I can feel it dipping in and out. But in the last few years, we have seen major indications of disruption in the global order, and I will speak about this in greater detail shortly. Among others, the unipolar world that was largely dominated by the United States for several decades has now become tripolar in a sense. We could argue that, with Russia, China, Russia and China becoming major global actors, challenging what we had seen as US hegemony. We have seen the Syrian crisis, the Yemen crisis, the Iran nuclear crisis, the North Korean activities as they were, the Russian-Ukraine war still ongoing, and many other developments which have demonstrated this. Even internal developments brought about changes that were unimaginable a few years ago, as we've seen in the case of Brexit in the United Kingdom. So it's a world in which so much is going on, with so much ramifications for not just the international space, but for the African continent in particular. What I want to do is pose a number of questions for us to consider. The first is the nature of the global order itself. Whose order is it? And what has it got to do with Africa? Where is Africa located in all of this? How much change or continuity is there in actual sense? And what really needs to change for Africa? Where does the opportunity for that change lie? These are some of the questions I want to just try to pose and respond to piecemeal, and hope that the panel will take up after this talk as well. But underpinning all of this, I want to present an argument that when it comes to the impact of global order and disorder on Africa, one, there's more continuity than change. Two, we see more of the impact of Africa's own inactions, in addition to the double standards that have been acknowledged of global powers at almost any point in time. Three, this is a new moment of opportunity for Africa to renegotiate its position and come up with its own proposals to rebalance its relationship with the global powers, old and new. But essentially, in addition to this, I want to add on something which I think might end up being actually the core of the point that I'm making. I want to suggest that Africa might learn something from the very approaches that have undermined the continent for decades, both in terms of how global actors exercise protectionist principles, and also in terms of their organizing formula. I want to suggest that Africa might have a thing or two to learn from the very actions that have undermined the continent for decades. But in the time that I have, what I want to do is the following. First, I want to clarify dominant patterns of global order or disorder and its manifestations across key defining moments. It's important that we situate this, that we provide a context for it. Second, I want to highlight some markers of impact in Africa by looking at aspects of Africa's trajectory and its response to the prevailing order at those key moments. And lastly, I want to examine this new moment of opportunity that the current crisis in Ukraine represents, and the makings of a new African response that we can see through, for example, the development of a common position for COP27. So I think it's important to begin to really, really seriously interrogate what the opportunities are here and what it means for how Africa responds to this global space in the future. So global order and disorder, let me start. Whose order is it anyway? And the idea of what constitutes global order or disorder is contested oftentimes. But I'm not proposing here that we engage deeply with that contestation. Rather, I'm proposing that we discuss this idea of order or disorder on the basis of the practical realities that confront Africa as it seeks to locate itself in the still unfolding global disorder that is manifesting itself in what seems to be the continuing spiraling of Western hegemony. However, in its simplest sense, and I apologize for international relations scholars in the room, this can be one of the Bibles of international relations, and I would not bore you, but just to say that in Hedley Bull's own words, in terms of his anarchical society, he defines this international order as a pattern of activity that sustains the elementary or primary goals of the society of states or the international society. But global disorder seen through the lens of liberal scholars is about essentially a liberal world order based on the assumptions that liberal democratic norms, if you like, institutions, and a rules-based system offer the best solutions to global challenges, be they terrorism, globalization, public health. But we've just been through a pandemic. And so that gives us an opportunity to really interrogate what this means, whether actually this is so. So, if you like, representative governments, international institutions, and trade, all of the markers of the liberal order are meant to maintain a mutually reinforcing virtuous cycle. And several scholars have discussed this already. But this order needs policing or guardianship. A powerful actor who guards the system, makes sides payments when necessary, corrals dissenters, and stands up to even those who are trying to subvert the system. As Dominic Tierney notes, the question is whether this is a sufficient motive for powerful actors to make costly sacrifices to protect the system. And this is the role that the United States has played at different moments from the end of the First World War, even though there are a few gaps here and there, and since the end of the Second World War. But the US has not always been a willing hegemon. We've seen that at different moments. And we have seen that whether in terms of its isolationist policies in the 1930s, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, or its election, most recently, of a president in 2016 that himself was a strong opponent of this particular liberal order, which is partly why we're where we are. So, quoting, for example, Anne-Marie Slaughter, the post-1945 world order that is now coming to an end. At least there's some acknowledgement that that world order is coming to an end. It required a hegemon, a nation among nations that was willing to absorb the cost of making the global machinery work and insisting that other nations meet the commitments that they had agreed to. So historically, the United States has been essential in creating institutions, anchoring alliances, and providing public goods. What we see today in the form of the United Nations still rests on the very institution that was helped into being by the United States. And I want to just put on our radar two things that underscored the creation of the United Nations at the time, which, the undermining of those very norms has become one of the biggest markers of the decline of the liberal order. One, the idea that we would outlaw crimes against humanity. Two, the idea that we condemn and render illegal the idea of a war of aggression. Those things have come to pass in several ways, but I'll come to that in a minute. So it is also the case that powerful actors have emerged at various moments, so-called illiberal actors, or however you consider liberal order and illiberal order, but that these actors have emerged to challenge the liberal order, which can produce now the opposite of that virtuous circle, a vicious cycle. So the East-West rivalry, for example, that ensued for decades after, a few years after the Second World War, and today, the emerging East-West competition are all evidence of this. Emergence of powerful illiberal actors can render the so-called liberal order quite fragile. So in its evolution, the liberal order, as well as its contestation, it's not always been without contestation, which is why we had the Cold War that we had and why we have this moment in history now. But just to say in bullet points that we could see those defining moments as the post-Second World War moment in which the creation of the United Nations outlawed, as I said earlier, crimes against humanity and wars of aggression. That is what everybody got together to say never again to. The Cold War itself, the emergence of the Cold War and East-West rivalry, that we saw the whole world only in that binary for a long time. The nuclear arms race, which led to MAD, the idea of a mutual assured destruction, but which produced a deterrence that kept war off of European continent, off of European soil for decades until the 1990s. And of course, former Yugoslavia, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, which led to fragmentation and contestation and conflicts in several parts of Europe, not least the former Yugoslavia. We've also seen how the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the euphoric cries of the triumph of the liberal order, or the emergence of the liberal order, as it were. All right? So ignoring, if you like, or underplaying some of the issues that underlined the negotiated settlements at the end of the Cold War. For those who studied this at the time or watched it unfold, you would have seen the intermediate range nuclear forces. You would have seen how Russia's former president at the time also declared they would like to join NATO, and it was a thing of laughter in some classrooms, because how can you join NATO? How can the very thing that you existed in opposition to, that existed in opposition to you, be something that you wanted to join? But something underpinned that essentially. The idea that, if you're part of NATO, you're essentially actually then rendering irrelevant the idea of extension of borders beyond where they were. We never had those conversations. So, from nuclear arms control to new rules of engagement, we saw in 1991 the height of this triumphant Western liberal order. The first Iraq War, which occurred, which, for the first time did not produce any veto in the UN Security Council. The absence of that veto in the Council made that first Iraq War possible. But that war itself was about dealing with a war of aggression. Never mind all of the subtle conversations around the importance of Kuwait and the importance of protecting Kuwait and what happened, what it was about, the very essence of oil and energy sources and so on. But in terms of its principle, this was to prevent a war of aggression from being sealed in Kuwait. So from around 1990, for nearly two decades afterwards, depending on what you're counting, the world saw a unipolar world led by the United States. The element of the dominant liberal order, please bear this in mind because this is at the crux of the conversation that I'm having here. The elements had it had three important underpinning elements. Ideological, underpinned by democratic norms. Ideological again, economic ideology, underpinned by liberal economics and the notion of institutions. And all of this sealed by, a global hegemon that provided security cover. I'm sure in this room I'm speaking to the converted. The ambassadors in the room have this as their bread and butter, understanding it and doing it on a daily basis and trying to assess it on a daily basis is what they do best. But there's little doubt that the post-1945 world order is maybe experiencing its last gap. Maybe, right? And we're in a transitional moment for sure. We will wait to see what replaces that. But let's be clear about the events that triggered this and are accelerating that decline even as we speak, thus challenging claims about the viability of a liberal world order. First, the war against terror, what the terror of 9/11 itself did, and the Afghanistan and Iraq wars have to be seen as important markers of change. But the 2008 global financial crisis was a major moment to look at. It exposed inequalities and the fragility of the West and of liberal economics. The rise of China, which became even more prominent from that moment onwards, is an important thing, and I don't want to, again, belabor things by telling us all the key elements of that rise. That rise is no longer contested, and that's a fact. Russian annexation of Crimea, and that's why I was making that point about what the United Nations stood for. It stood against the war of aggression, for example. But Russian annexation of Crimea marked a clear moment in which the dismantling of the only remaining norm that underpinned the United Nations began. Crimes against humanity having been, if you like, effectively relegated to the dustbin or trash can of history, because we have seen crimes against humanity at so many moments, and we have not been that effective in dealing with them. All right? So, in a sense, those responses had various weaknesses in them. But Russia's attack of Ukraine confirmed that this last norm of the United Nations, the illegality of the war of aggression, has effectively really been dealt with. If nothing else was learned, all weaker nations that might have once relied on the promise of the protection of a Western alliance understood that there are only light shades of that protection. Then COVID-19 further exposed the absence of a global machinery to protect the world when everyone and everything is threatened all at once. Every nation retreated beyond its borders, including the powerful nations. It was everyone for themselves. It was not one for all and all for one. And I think that was a glaring moment for the continent of Africa to understand that when push comes to shove, the idea of this global protection, this global system that took care of weak nations, all of that meant nothing unless it was the security of those very powerful actors that was threatened. So thus, ideologically, institutionally, and economically, almost all of the norms of the rules-based system that underpins the liberal order have been undermined without a clear and effective response to reverse it. At once, the liberal order the liberal order and the US hegemonic leadership of the world is confronted by the rise of China and contestation from Russia. That's where we are. The former challenging the economic dominance and the latter the political and institutional logic of the liberal order. And I want to try to wrap up this part as I want to get into the Africa, to discuss Africa's trajectory and response. And that is to say that I want to recognize that there are interesting claims by scholars. One of my most recent examination is that by Dominic Teani, who I mentioned earlier, which suggests that any prediction of the death of the liberal order may be premature, and I want to recognize that, because the very existence of these threats serves to revive the liberal order. The existence of an opposing closed bloc, the contrast drawn by Americans between the free world and the unfree world has driven the formation and unity of the US-led open bloc. That means, in a sense, even hegemons and those orders need something to oppose them in order to ramp up what they have and respond to it. So the liberal needs the liberal, he says. Hegemonic stability theorists, he argues, see a single uncontested state as a key for global order, but it is precisely contestation that impels a powerful actor to build the liberal order. Washington defends the order when it is threatened, not when it is unthreatened. He adds, no hegemon in history has, at the zenith of its power and without any competitor, acted with sustained restraint and benevolence. I accept that, because the First Cold War was also about this. But in 2016, we cannot ignore the fact that in that year, the very leader of the free world elected a leader that had no respect for that liberal order. And that is partly why we're having some of these conversations. So let me talk about Africa's trajectory and response. Where is Africa located in all of this? At the start, I indicated that Africa has been at the receiving end of global vicissitudes. Where Africa is concerned, the prevailing order at any point in time has produced nothing but inequality, I argue. That order was established by ideological, military, and economic hegemony. Africa has been marginalized, has been marginal to all of this. Again, ideologically, economically, militarily, and institutionally. The reason I keep mentioning all these things together is that there is a logic to this madness. Any global system that holds that space combines all of these things at once, not in isolation. So when you see security arrangements, they're designed to protect the very economic order, the very political order that is underpinned by particular ideological stances. There's a logic to it. So indeed, African countries that became independent dominions, African countries that became independent dominions at the heart of the Cold War were immediately immersed. I'm trying to go back a few decades. At independence, our countries were immersed in the Cold War politics, and they were compelled to claim allegiance to one alliance or the other, at least ideologically, and often to guarantee their security. Economically or militarily, they were wrapped into this agenda, even when it meant that states and governments in Africa were terrorizing their own citizens. Let's be clear. The non-aligned movement, whose origins I will not rehash here, was the Global South's response to managing the impact of East-West rivalry on their countries. They sent a clear message that they were for neither East nor West. To be clear, Africa was not entirely without agency, even when the global power dynamics provided Hobson's choice, that is, little or no alternative. While individual African states and their leaders made choices about their political stance, East, West, non-aligned, the Organization of African Unity had clear objectives that included an approach to preventing conflict through the maintenance of colonially inherited borders, if you like, and a commitment to ensuring the independence and liberation of the parts of Africa yet to realize political freedom at that time. But what, for those of us who are peace and security scholars, we have been compelled to really embrace interdisciplinarity, if you like, transdisciplinarity, because that picture is always incomplete without the economic aspect of the story. And economically, Africa has remained at the receiving end of global economic structures and institutions. The underpinning economic ideology that governs the approach of global financial policies and institutions invariably favors rich nations at the expense of Africa. We know that no nation has ever really developed without a strong manufacturing and production base. Furthermore, unhelpful policies such as structural adjustment reduce the state's role in much-needed development at a critical period in Africa's history. Scholars such as Adebayo Olukoshi have written extensively about this. So invariably, Africa's manufacturing capacity continues to be in decline. Apart from increased mining, and this is what economic figures don't tell us enough, when you begin to see a rise in GDP, and you begin to see that raw material sales are going up, several things are happening. All of that rise does not often point to the fact that this is about mining and extraction of Africa's natural resources to other parts of the world. And at moment when Africa's raw materials seem to be doing well, those raw materials were going to develop other nations, including China, that has now come to the fore of international agenda. We have seen several Latin American countries rely on Africa's raw material as well. So apart from that, really, industry is in decline. And really that decline in manufacturing production is a big part of it. And when we're told that Africa will leapfrog industrialization and then get into, we might be in a fourth industrial revolution, we might be not, we might even be able to use green energy to propel ourselves into greatness, I think is one of the big lies that we're being told or that we're telling ourselves. So the rise in raw material export in Africa is often accompanied by demand arising from other countries' industrialization processes, as I said earlier. The continent seems doomed, therefore, to remaining a supplier of raw materials unless its leaders set a new framework of engagement. This is why I see this moment of opportunity as something that allows Africa, that might allow Africa to renegotiate the terms of its engagement with the global community. But similarly, in terms of military security, let's ask, why is it the case that there has been greater readiness to keep repressive regimes in power through transfer of arms and finance, all of which keeps the citizens impoverished while they deliver economic interest to the global power allies? That's a question we need to ask ourselves. But the question to pose today, as we begin to look at Africa's place in the next phase, in this next phase, is to a set of questions. And let me pose them. I am not about to provide final answers here. It's for us to begin to interrogate the situation and see what kinds of answers to find collectively. Will any of the global powers, whether we're talking about the US, Russia, China, even the European Union, in its formation, which is quite smart in its response to these global vicissitudes, will any of them ensure that Africa is enabled to industrialize, produce raw materials, and create industries at home, thus strengthening African economies? Will they? Can they? Really? In whose interest in the global north is it that Africa should multiply manufacturing capacity and industrialize to get its citizens out of cycles of poverty and insecurity? Who in the global north will say that is our interest, to see Africa emerge in this place? So the question really tying all of this together that we must ask ourselves 6 decades later is whether and how Africa could have come up with its own ideas about what Africa's international relations could look like, whether it could have renegotiated its stance economically and militarily, and rebalance its relationship with global power. And indeed, I must say for a time, Africa did ask and did answer some of these questions, only for us, for the continent to regress. So how must Africa now manage this relationship? But when I say we asked and answered, I'm talking about the period from 2000 that saw a culmination of a new African agenda. Between 2000 and 2002, for example, NEPAD, and that's a new Partnership for Africa's Development, and its African peer review mechanism, and the creation of the new African Union launched a period of a self-confident Africa, at least that's how it seemed, which could self-regulate and also engage the world on its own terms. The Constitutive Act of the African Union set a new vision for the continent. Indeed, these new norms, whether you looked at ECOWAS initially and the African Union later, set the agenda for new international norms, such as the African Peace and Security Architecture, that framed a new security agenda. But in time, with a change of leadership, because for those who recall, South Africa under President Mbeki, Nigeria under President Obasanjo, Algeria under Bouteflika, Senegal at the time, and so on. 5 or 6 countries shaped this for Africa. So can you see the story? We were beginning to have a conversation around development wrapped with a conversation around security. We were shaping the norms and building institutions, in short, a mini form of order for the continent. And it had custodians. And I'm putting that on the table as I talk about, as I then come to what we have now, right? So we saw the framing of a new vision, but in time, with a change of leadership among the leaders and states that oversaw the framing of this new vision, these ambitions waned. We have seen appropriation of some of these norms and of the AU space. I call it appropriation, and I'm happy to explain later. The funding of APSA, for example, and related activities by global and middle powers, including China, including some of these powers that have now emerged, all of them combined, reinforces the separation of security from the economic and human development agenda of Africa. So have you seen the rest of the world, when they maintain that order, they keep these things together. Liberal order connects everything, the ideology that underpins the politics, the economics, the security, and it guards it with hegemonic power. But for us in Africa, the support separated those things. So if we don't have a say in the economics of it ourselves and in the development agenda, and we allow the continent to be just rammed into a security conversation that we lose control of, what happens? So the cherry picking of priorities by external actors has remained a feature of AU engagement with the rest of the world. We lost the plot somewhere, even though we articulated what was a solid vision, and some of those norms are some of the best in the world still. So, as evidence of disorder or a changing order emerged, Africa has not taken advantage of this to increase its voice, to uplift its status, or renegotiate its stance in relation to all powers. All. We could argue that Africa was not in the best position to assert itself in the era of the First Cold War, but we can no longer, and we ought not to make that argument anymore. If we made that argument, it will mean that we have not done the intellectual work, and we have actually not, been truthful in the face of the evidence in front of us. But instead, other regions took advantage of it. We have seen other regions and middle powers, some acquired middle power status, in fact, taking advantage of the emerging global disorder by negotiating a new stance and rebalancing their relationships with older new powers. And many of them, inadvertently or not, advertently or inadvertently, it's not for me to hold brief for them, rode on Africa's back to do this. So we have seen regions with many small countries and middle powers continue to negotiate their position as a bloc. I want to really say that the EU exemplifies this as a prime example. Many small nations, some middle powers, coming together is a big strategy for them. And that's how they're managing to deal with emergence of China, the rise of China, as well as the United States that stopped being the hegemon that they expected. Even when Biden took over, the nervousness that the US might return to what happened in 2016 is not making the European Union sit easy. And they know that as a bloc, they must really articulate these points for themselves. So, we now, though, where Africa is concerned, have seen a convening of African countries by these small powers and middle powers. In the last decade, it's become one of the symbols. Whether you can convene Africa has become one of the symbols of achieving middle power or big power status for a number of countries, right? Through, for example, summits like China Africa, France Africa, Russia Africa, Brazil Africa, India Africa, Turkey Africa. I may have left some out. We have seen the Gulf countries also assert themselves in relation to Africa. Yet, our 55 African countries have impressive premises in Addis Ababa, where the AU can host such summits, without our heads of states going to shake hands, to really be put on show in different foreign capitals. This portrayal, even if unintended, right, really makes Africa seem subservient, and it is unfortunate. So, in short, we lost the opportunity to emerge, in part, not in totality, due to a crisis of leadership, a lack of new ideas, epitomized by the failure of the African Union. I have discussed this elsewhere, so I'm not going to rehash those things. I would rather want to go to the last part of my lecture by looking at a new moment of opportunity for Africa. And I suggest we might be witnessing a new moment of awareness, a new awakening as a result of recent developments in the world. What are those developments? The COVID-19 response is one, and I already talked about it. Even if African countries were under any illusion that the people of Africa matter to the global powers of the rest of the world, we now know better. Every country retreated within its borders, as I said earlier. Its revelation about Africa's place and its value in that global order. It's at the bottom of the rung. Even when our presidents, the president of this country too, current president of this country, President Ramaphosa, went to try to persuade, try to just, let's have a collective approach as a continent. Let's persuade that at least if we're given the intellectual property, if Africa matters that much, to research those vaccines so that we don't start afresh, research and produce them, even with the promise, whether it's COVAX, whatever it is that was put together to send vaccines to Africa, I believe that as of a few months ago, not the amount that was promised was given. Is it not just very fortunate that Africans didn't die by the millions that were expected at the beginning of the pandemic? But now let's go to the Russian-Ukraine war. The implications for Africa and the rest of the world have been profound. It's not just Africa that has been impacted. It's been profound, from food insecurity to energy insecurity. We're having serious, deep conversations. I was not going to go into the United Nations as such, because I think that's conversation for another time. But the one time that the United Nations has managed to mediate in any of these conflicts, in this particular conflict, has been when it was mediating to negotiate that grain can leave Ukraine. Maybe we're beginning to see a new role for the United Nations. I don't know. I mean, I believe very much in the ideals of the United Nations, and I believe that a global institution, it's important to maintain a form of order at a minimum. But actually that institution is seeing its own decline rapidly as well. So when you look at this, at the Ukraine war, and you look at the implications for Africa, you begin to see also where Africa stood in all of this. You could see how we witnessed African citizens, how they were being treated differently from citizens of other nations at the borders when they were fleeing the consequences of the war in Ukraine at the initial stages. All of this has telltale signs of the low status of Africans globally, of Africa globally. But more significantly, we're seeing a new Cold War, and we've been seeing it emerge, but at this moment, I think we're beginning to become immersed in a new form of Cold War, along with a new scramble for Africa, as it were. So Russia has intensified its engagement. China was never far away from Africa, has been in Africa for a long time, more than a century, has engaged differently. You're seeing that suddenly the UK itself, in its new incarnation outside of the European Union, is engaging Africa, more fiercely, sees Africa as part of its, if you like, a new strategy. We've seen the European Union, who has had its own form of engaging Africa. And Africa's response to this, and of course, let's also understand it. The accompanying politics of China's emergence, the West and Russia's contestation in Ukraine, it's leading also to a new search for resources. And Africa is right at the heart of this when we're talking about oil and gas and the like, the new sources of energy, for example. Africa's response to this emerging, of this is emerging, but the initial signs have been about individual countries making choices about how to respond. The voting patterns at the United Nations take us back to old Cold War divisions in which African states were caught between voting for one ideological bloc or another in the United Nations. Emblematic of the global disorder, Africa still seems unable to get clarity and still lacks a collective voice. Some have tried to abstain. Some want to protect their economic relations with Beijing. I might even want to see which way China is voting before casting their votes. If worried about arms, a vote for Russia might work for them. And if economic aid is paramount, then they might stick with the West. This is an unfortunate situation to be in, position to be in. I'm in South Africa, so I don't want to embroil myself in the debate in South Africa about, how this country has responded to that. But let me let me say something about the notion of non-alignment. I want to argue strongly that we cannot retreat to that conversation about non-alignment of the first Cold War. This is a new time, new space in Africa. What are we declaring neutrality for? Neutral to what? We cannot be neutral to the exploitation of Africa. We cannot be neutral to the fact that we're in a place where everyone climbs on Africa's back to be successful, to be a successful nation. My argument is we must reconsider. And so as I take this try to take this home now, Africa can learn a lot from the approach of the global powers in projecting the global order. Old or new, liberal or illiberal. I made that point at the start, and that's why I said I think it's an important point that I don't want to miss. That in the same way, the same tools, the same approaches and instruments that were used to either conquer Africa, repress Africa, but actually keep Africa in the same place where it's been, there might be value in looking at some of those things, and that's why I talk collectively about it's not a separation between ideology. There's economic ideology, there's political ideology. There is the institutional framework that wraps it together. There is a hegemonic protection of that. So the ideological, economic, military, security, and institutional framework, it's integrated. It has not been piecemeal or in isolation. all middle or big power nations projecting their position of power in Africa have an interconnection between their political and economic interests, and they have military deployments or interventions in many cases to back this up. So please witness the military presence in the Horn of Africa. What is it for? Why are some middle, powers who actually do not have any intentions of running over anything present in the Horn of Africa? What is that about? What are they protecting? I don't think it's African citizens in that sense that are being protected. Let's ask those questions and ask them very clearly and seek to begin to look for answers to them. So if and when Africa awakens, it must be well advised to take an integrated stance and not to focus on one area or the other. It's not about security and not about development or economic ideology. Africa needs its own economic ideology to rise from the place where it's been buried by global power dynamics. The economic and political vision, along with a collective security strategy, pursued as one bloc, collectively negotiated and not bilaterally, we signify that Africa has come of age. Every time we have an African Union, and I would a couple of words of praise as I begin to wrap up for our Africa, for continental free trade agreement, which is not yet there, but actually that if we don't revolutionize it, it will not get where it needs to get to. If we don't use the power that the African Development Bank has today and connect all of that across the board and do it collectively, European Union is wise. If we don't do it collectively as Africa, but we continue to negotiate bilaterally, we will be kept down, is what I'm suggesting. And we see an emerging Africa for once. This is something to be excited about. From the approach being taken to the negotiation on climate change, to the energy crisis and COP27 in particular. I think the chairperson was mentioning COP27 at the start. Evidence from the International Renewable Energy Agency suggests, and I quote, that Africa has attracted just 2% of the world's clean energy investment in the last 20 years. 2%. Let's get it. 17% of the world, roughly. Only about 3 to 4% of the pollution, but actually the vulnerabilities are much more, and yet 2%. And that actually mirrors everything across the board. We're just seeing it in the area of investment in clean energy. So for me, it's been heartening to see African negotiators take a common position on climate that is arguably informed by science. Before 2008, each African state negotiated its own position, whilst the EU negotiated collectively. I mean, really, if South Africa negotiates its own position and has the human capacity to do that, the human resources and so on, are we seriously saying that Guinea-Bissau would have a stage to negotiate its own position? Or Lesotho, let me come nearer home. Why are we the way we are? But thankfully, since 2009, this has been changing. But we now have a science-led approach underpinning the negotiations and being emulated even by other parts of the developing world. This is something to celebrate. But I don't want us to suddenly be celebrating yet, but take a look at that position. It is revolutionary in a sense. That the position of the negotiators is clear, that fossil fuels are necessary to expanding economies and electricity access. The same fossil fuels that we're being told need to be jettisoned, and clean energy. Many are arguing that the clean energy that we have, if you're relying on solar, wind energy, cannot enhance Africa's industrialization to where it needs to go to. But at least the argument is being made now. And how will that negotiation proceed? How will Africa, if Africa continues to do this collectively, we might be getting somewhere. But let me say to you, however, that the African group of negotiators, expert support, referred to as AGNES, is supported by the Canadian International Development Research Center, IDRC. So this tells its own story, all right? But having said that, there will always be partnerships, and the sustained IDRC support is an example of partnership that promotes African agency, and they've supported this consistently for some time. So in bringing this lecture to a conclusion, what will be the basis of Africa's negotiation of a new global order, liberal or otherwise? What should be the basis? If a noticeable shift is to occur, there are 5 things very briefly. The continent must speak with one voice, that's number 1. Secondly, that collective voice must place economic and political ideology at the fore of its dialogue with the rest of the world, and all seen through a collective African security lens. Thirdly, the one ideological vision must not lean towards classical Anglophone, Francophone, or Lusophone divides, and it should be neither West nor East, but it must be wholly shaped by African-led ideas of change. Nothing says we can't borrow from other places when they work for Africa, but it has to be an African-led agenda to start with. African institutional framework, that's number 4, that combines norms with a clear agenda, revolutionizing the African continental free trade area and making use of the ADB and revamping NEPAD idea in a new form. We have almost killed NEPAD, but actually the framing at the time required an accession to a set of values around which we can use to govern the continent. And there might be something, a reframing that needs to happen there. But my point is that this new ascension to a continental vision, a shared continental vision, should be at the core of a new institutionalization. 5th and last, intellectual engagement that places value in African knowledge institutions. This is one aspect of Europe's success. Its universities and the science they produce underpin European success in various fields. I'm just coming from an AROA meeting with the European Guild of Universities, of Research Universities in Cape Town. And you could see that the Guild has traveled far, but these two knowledge institutional networks, if you like, are trying to frame the AU-EU agenda. And actually the success that we have in putting knowledge into the AU-EU strategy is not as a result of the African Union, it's despite the African Union. And that is sad. But the EU listened and then tried to bring all of us in. And if nations don't use their knowledge institutions, where can progress be realized? So connecting all of this by making the best use of institutions that can mobilize Africa's knowledge institutions and its public intellectuals to facilitate the making of a new vision for Africa is a must if we're to realize, document, and measure Africa's progress without dependence only on Western or Eastern ideas and agendas. And my plea is that institutions such as the Thabo Mbeki School should see this as one of their primary goals and facilitate this and similar institutions across the continent. We need the knowledge, we need to consolidate that knowledge and make it speak back to the continent and to the rest of the world, but we also need the public intellectualism to make that happen. I think that's partly what we're trying to do here today. I want to thank you. Thank you so much.